Today on Rebuilders, we are looking at practices.
Yeah, spiritual practices are really helpful, formed the people of God for many years. But a question we're getting asked more and more is there a point where spiritual practices in extreme become unhelpful, disconnect us from the people of God? We're going to look at that and more, and some of the great challenges of what it is to form people today in our crazy, complex, chaotic culture.
Yeah, it's a great episode. We look forward to sharing it with you. Welcome to Rebuilders. My name is Liddy and I'm here with Mark and Daniel. How are you both today?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Very good. Very good. We're back from our live recording.
Thanks to
Yes.
everyone who came out. It was fantastic.
Yeah, loved it.
Al Gordon put up some pictures today on Instagram and it was like, wow, looked great.
Wow.
Good on us.
Good on it. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks to Al too for coming and being
Yeah.
part of that, and everyone who turned up and all those who helped.
Yes,
Yeah.
thank you all. It was
It
a
was
great night.
quite a powerful ministry time afterwards as well.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
it was sort of like, I know it's sort of a podcast is a very head-based thing, but just to see, a lot of people, like so many people come forward for prayer and
Yeah.
spirit moving. So yeah, really encouraging.
Yeah.
That's good. I've got some excellent banter.
Oh, wow. Okay.
I've been sitting on this for a while, looking very chuffed over there.
The first thing I want you to know is that I'm okay. Okay?
Okay.
I'm doing okay.
Okay, good. Because we were so deeply worried.
Yeah.
I experienced my first robbery.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
In-person robbery.
In person?
On the weekend, yeah. I was down at the shops
Yep.
getting
at
some
the shops.
groceries and in come three hooligans, hooded hooligans,
Wow.
and stole alcohol from the shop.
Not from you though.
Not from me,
Okay.
from the shelves. I tried to stop them.
Oh.
I tried to stop them. And,
How did you try and stop them?
by holding out my arms, but I had a basket in one hand.
Oh, magical.
milk in it.
Yeah.
And I tried to block them and they pushed past me.
How old were they?
Hard to say because their hoods were covering
Give us a guess.
20s.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Did you say, thou shalt not pass?
No, I said, hey, you've got to pay for that, as their arms were laden with bottles of whiskey.
I reckon they knew that.
Yes.
Yeah, and they ignored me, pushed past me.
Wow.
And the cashier lady shook her head at me don't try and fix this.
Yeah.
Just let him go. Anyway, found out it's been happening like every 2 days to that shop.
Oh,
for a
that's
while.
really?
Wow.
Yeah, so
Oh.
anyway, but I was walking back home after that, a little bit on edge. I thought I could have done a citizen's arrest. Not even sure if it's legal in Australia.
You can,
to do that.
you can definitely
can, yeah.
arrest people in Australia as citizens.
Good to
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
But no, unfortunately, they got away.
So
So anyway,
can I just ask a question? How were you, one man, going to arrest three men?
I don't think he quite
I'm
thought
not doubting.
that
I'm
far.
not doubting your physical capacity.
Have you read Samson?
Wow.
The story of
Wouldn't the right thing that you just would then pull the door? You'd push the doorway down, and the entire store would collapse on everyone. That's the Samson option.
Yeah, no, I thought, look, at best I could have grabbed one and maybe interrogated him. Found out where
Wow.
the
the
robber's
others
nest
went.
is.
I got robbed years ago.
Did you?
Yeah. On a youth group event.
Okay.
So I was this was way back when I was a youth pastor, and it was at like the Royal Melbourne Show, which is like this county fair for those listening, and all of the kids wanted to go on this ride, so everyone gave me their wallets. And I sat down on a park bench because I get a bit ill on
Just in your arms, like
in my pockets.
cradling.
Your pockets.
And,
How many pockets did you have?
And
It was the time of cargo pants, wasn't it?
Deep pocket cover.
yeah, possibly.
Yeah.
And this young woman just comes up to me and goes, "Oh, the guys." I sat down on this bench and there was people sitting there, and she goes, "Oh, the guys on either side of you have got knives." And I looked down and there was a guy with a knife in my side, and
Not in your side yet. Pointed towards your side.
it was but it wasn't. It was
Okay,
touching
by
my
your side.
side.
Yeah,
and I said, "Oh, they said, give us stuff." And I mean, this is just the stupidity of youth, the stupidity of the male brain. At I don't know, I was 20 something. I just was like, no. What are you going to do with this? I've only got $2. What are you going to do? And he sort of looked at me. I mean, we were looking. He's literally like 2 feet from me. He's in eyes, and I'm just looking in the eyes. And he just sort of realized, like, well, I'm going to either stab him or I just have to go. And then it was a flick knife. So he pressed the button and went back in, and they got up and walked off.
Oh,
Wowee.
wow. How's the tenacity of Mark Sayers?
Yeah, that was the biggest. Like, I was rocking after that. The adrenaline rush. I was just like,
Yeah, strutting around.
Yeah. So, and then I think
It's
also
like
it
you
did
went
happen.
on the ride.
I think some of the kids maybe started coming back. It was
Same adrenaline.
Some of the kids started coming back from the ride, I think, as well. So there was a bunch of people coming towards. So he's like, okay, here comes a bunch of people. Yeah. But I just wouldn't. I mean, today I just wouldn't do that. Like, what was I thinking? You know.
Far out.
Well done.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, and well done to me.
Have you made an award for yourself? Oh, wow. Oh, well, that's not where the banter with. That's a long banter, but I think it was worth it. Everybody.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Wow, you really held on to that story.
I was like, this is too good to share just
Wow.
in a lunchtime conversation. It's got to be recorded.
Yeah. So if you'd like to donate bottles of vodka and whiskey to Daniel's local liquor store, please send them into who knows where. Crime Stoppers.
Oh, wow.
Good. All right, there
Okay.
you go.
Well, thank you, Daniel.
That's right.
Yeah, that was a fun ride. On today's episode, we are looking at practices and discipleship. Practices, spiritual practices and formation have been so important to the church throughout church history. And we saw a resurgence of them in the early 2000s or mid-noughties kind of era. And Mark, you're a big advocate for practices and spiritual formation, talked about it in a number of books and sermon series. But we're asking the question today, could the overemphasis on practices actually be unhelpful for the church?
Yeah. And it's interesting. So this is something which I'm increasingly asked. And often you have these sort of offline conversations that you see, well, more and more people are asking about this. And I think what people mean by unhelpful is, can it get to a point where it becomes an individualistic approach? It becomes an approach which is disconnected from church even. And an approach which, almost has a return to a spirit of religiosity around it. If I listen to people's concerns, I would boil them down into those 3 categories. So I thought, like, as someone who's obviously, contributed to the conversation and advocated for this, I thought, I should give some of the reflections that I've been giving to people as they've asked me this. I also did a couple of lectures at Bridgetown Church recently. We can link them in the notes. So I'm not going to cover some of the ground I covered there, where I talked more about productivity and burnout and that sort of thing. But I thought this is a really worthwhile conversation to have, as it's on the lips of many leaders.
So let's maybe explore the context in which it's sort of more recently emerged.
Yeah. So look, for me, obviously practice has been around for a long time. What are practices? These are the things that the church does. It can be prayer, it can be Sabbath, it can be generosity of giving to the poor, things that are actions that we do. And, for me, I noted something that was happening in the 2000s, and, obviously the contemporary church movement has been a huge movement. There's forms of it which are Pentecostal. There's forms of it which are evangelical. There's different, sort of slight theological emphases, but effectively the evangelical contemporary church has been one of the big growth points in the church for some time. But one of the sort of, I think, weak spots that we began to see was that this mission to be relevant to a culture which was secularizing had the ability to often gather people, but its ability to create resilient disciples was perhaps limited at times. And so you began to see, I think, in the 2000s and particularly the early 2010s, this realization about amongst many pastors that, hang on, we've got a lot of people in the room, but a lot of them are not actually following Jesus in the way that we would assume. A lot don't even necessarily theologically agree with us, or on certain ethical issues don't agree with us. And so we're not forming them. And this began as sort of like a background conversation, and additionally, you began to see that people's connection with church began to be more light touch. They were less likely to be involved in discipleship groups. They came to church less and less regularly. And so for the contemporary church model, this presented a real challenge. The danger was that you could look great on the surface, lots of people in a room, lots of energy, lots of excitement, but there was sort of this sense that I think a lot of pastors had that, hang on, this is not really forming people. And so whilst the outside of the structure looked good, there was weakness on the inside. Now, additionally, if you look at the 2010s, I think in places like Australia and Europe and whatever, New Zealand or Canada, there was always a sense in the sort of West that there was secularism it's been here for some time. But you began to see, I think, the US church, which drives so much of the content and ideas and creativity around contemporary Christianity, begin to reckon with what it felt like an ascending secularism. US for a long time had a huge degree of cultural Christianity, and that really began to get challenged politically, culturally. You began to see shifts. So the realization that, hang on, maybe we're not forming people in the way that we thought we were just by having a great service. There was a lot of assumed cultural Christian values, theologically and ethically. And hang on, they're not there. And what's the driver of that? Well, it seems to be the culture. So, you began to see something where you saw churches that were like, well, we're going to be contemporary and we're going to preach an orthodox, gospel and orthodox biblical faith in the face of a culture which seems to be moving away from that. But there was some sort of, tension still, that if you were going to continue to pursue, at its core, contemporary church is built around relevance, but also in some ways is built around that relevance means you will feel comfortable in that place. So there's relevance. I'm speaking your language. I talked about that movie you saw last week as an illustration in the sermon, but also the seats are really comfortable and parking's great. And there's a whole range of programs that can suit you at every life stage. And, there's all these elements. So it brought up this sort of tension between wanting to adhere to people's preferences, wanting to adhere to their comfort so that they will come and so that they will stay. And as people became more light touch, that sort of just increased. But at the same time, like, hang on, I don't think this is forming people. So that was very clear. And then I think what happens is you begin to have a series of shocks. It's interesting. I wrote Disappearing Church. You would normally write a book about a year or 18 months before it. So I was really writing it in 2014, 2015. In 2016, you have the shock of the US election in Brexit in Britain. And this is when the conversations around polarization begin. So all of a sudden, that adds a weight to this conversation of just getting people in a room. All of a sudden, conversations around politics, race, all these things begin to come up, and pastors all of a sudden like, hang on, we didn't set up this system with capacity to deal with this. And people saw people being more formed by particular political ideologies or the hedonism of the culture than they realized. So it was almost like at that point that the veneer on the outside was ripped off. That bubbles away for a few years there, but then this sort of acceleration point. And I think that happened in the US, perhaps more than it happened in the rest of the West. It was happening in the rest of the West, but in the US it was very pronounced with the US 2016 election. But 2020 happens. And 2020, particularly in terms of COVID, to come to church, you look at it here in Australia. Australia's one of the things, we've also done our own version of contemporary church, done church really well. The biggest growing churches in Australia will tend to be contemporary Pentecostal churches. And then all of a sudden you can't meet in the room, or you're meeting in the room and there's a 2-meter radius around you. You've got to wear masks or you can't hang around after. And it put huge pressure on the contemporary church model. And the sort of post-COVID dynamics where people sort of, perhaps their circles of social life shrunk. And this really highlighted this great tension in the contemporary church between how do we pursue relevance and growth and also deeper discipleship. So into that space, practices were gobbled up like a health shake that is both healthy for you and delicious to drink. And I just saw that. I saw people, when you would talk about this, they're like, yes, this is what we need to do. We need to have a contemporary church that is, still relevant and orthodox and biblical, but at the same time, this is the solution which is going to form our people. And we saw that at Red. We saw people formed in ways. And so I'm saying here, that was a hugely fruitful thing. And I think a lot of my friends' churches which did something, you can see that it created this really strong core in lots of people and patterns around prayer. We're also part of 24/7 prayer. We've got a prayer room, so there's an element at Red. We're doing the Sunday service where we sing and worship, and there's that sort of, outward expression, joyful together. But then also we encourage people to come into the prayer room, and we've done things at Red like Monk for a month of, integrating different practices, going way back. I mean, we were doing that stuff in maybe 2009 or 2008 or 2010 or something. So I saw that as a really positive thing. And also too, like, this model you saw grow in it returned to spiritual formation, which guys like, Willard and Foster had been talking about for some time, the Renovare movement, all those guys have been talking about this for some time. So church has pushed into this big time, but I think that a contradiction is still there at the center of it, which is becoming a bit more acute at this time.
So, well, let's fast forward to now. What is it that's happening now that's causing these questions? What's changed? Are practices still relevant?
Yeah. So a couple of things. And this is one thing I did address in Portland when I spoke about this. Again, you look at that period from the 2000s up to, say, 2020, and it took some hits. But we spoke about this before on this podcast. You saw this rise in living standards. Possibilities seemed greater before people. You could travel more cheaply. You had apps which delivered things for you. This was the result of what Mervyn King called the nice period, no interest rates and constant expansion. And so really formation was positing itself against a secular culture. We used to talk about happy moral pagans that just seemed to be improving. If you go back to that period, it was just like the world had so many wonderful things on offer, and society seemed to promise you the ability to live a life without God. And this was a huge challenge. And in the face of this sort of like just constant cornucopia of consumer, sexual, travel experiences, all these things, we needed robust counterformation because that was forming us. Additionally, also what happens is social media comes along and we see the power of social media to form us. That also adds added impetus to the need for practices. However, coming out of COVID, the shine has gone off culture big time. The ability for culture to deliver us something, beautiful. Its culture is going through this tremendous credibility crisis. The social contract where we give up some of our freedom to government and those who are above us and have power in order for them to then deliver us something positive, that's breaking down. So all of a sudden, it's not so much the culture which is promising you all these wonderful things. Increasingly, that promise is breaking down. And particularly, you notice this in the US, you notice it everywhere. There's a cost of living crisis. I was in New Zealand, there's a cost of living crisis there, there's a cost of living crisis here. In the UK, Europe, you go everywhere, there's a cost of living crisis. Japanese election just happened. A lot of it around cost of living crisis, inflation. So all of a sudden, that began to change the dynamic. Plus, there was this sense of burnout, which had come from the COVID years, and some of the models of church. And I talk more about this in the Bridgetown lecture, which we're going to link. But a lot of the models of church was based on high volunteerism, high doing work, and there was this overarching burnout dynamic in the culture where all of a sudden practices, which was to form us against a robust, vigorous culture and attractive cultural formation as a counterformational force, all of a sudden it looks like everything's going to pot in the culture. There is increased global conflicts from Israel, Gaza to Ukraine, and the world politically doesn't seem to be getting better. I mean, you look at the US election that we're currently looking at now, seems like a repeat of what happened in 2016. So there began to be this danger that in a moment like this, practices are really wonderful, but the danger is that they can become a way of controlling my inner world when the outer world is out of control. So always, there's the danger with anything that is a spiritual practice that it will at some point be inhabited by the spirit of religiosity. Now, we have to go back in some of the history now. Some of the reasons, like why is there contemporary low churches? The reason that there are low churches and contemporary churches is you go back to the Reformation, other movements where it was a Reformation movement against what people saw as the use of different practices or rituals disconnected from their original meaning. They just became something that people did rote. And there was an element that they'd been infused with the spirit of religiosity. Religiosity is, I'm going to try and control this process, and it's something which has little grace in it. So in a world where also, if you look, there is a secular drive around life hacks, morning routines, a lot of the things that you see in practices are now being picked up in the culture. And it's almost this individualized version of doing life as the infrastructure, the political system, the cityscapes begin to seemingly unwind. I can create my own inner world. I can't change the rest of the world, but I can create my own inner world. And so if you take practices back to the original term, why is everyone using this word? Why do we, I think my dad's asked me this question. He's like, Mark, all this stuff, practices, it's just what we used to just call discipleship, you know, and my dad's right on that. Part of the reason around the popularity of the term practices is, Pierre Bourdieu talked about, he's a philosopher, sociologist, how we sort of behaved. And he said practices are part of his model. But he had this other element, which is habitus, which is really the sort of water that you swim in. It's the environment which shapes you and makes you act in particular ways that you're unaware of. When I go to America, I was just in America, even in New Zealand, there's certain things where you go, oh, hang on, I do that without even thinking about it because I'm shaped by that environment.
Yes.
And practices then are almost the actions that you take because of being shaped by your habitus is a very simplified version of how Bourdieu would explain that. So I think what I'm arguing here is the habitus has changed since before the pandemic. There was a habitus which was a very seductive secular culture, and there's still elements of that there, yes.
Sure, yeah.
Are we in a grey zone between two eras? Yes. Parts of the previous era here, yes. But the habitus is changing very, very quickly. And when the habitus changes, that can change the reason why we do certain practices. So what am I saying here? Am I saying that to stop doing practices? No, but to have an awareness that their form may be changing, or that the motivation behind them can be changing. And at moments where they become an avenue of control, that's something that we need to be aware of. And I think this is the unease that a lot of people are coming to me. So for example, a lot of people are coming to me, or pastors or whatever, and they're finding people in their congregation who have run with this, who are getting very religious spirit judgmental about this. Like, did you do your Sabbath yesterday? Well, hang on, I've got two little kids and it was a nightmare yesterday and I couldn't do it and I actually had to drive the car to, that sort of stuff. You're hearing more conversations about. There's a lack of grace around it, and the habitus has changed. And in moments like that, the spirit of control can come in.
Would you say that it's also like a self-religiosity that emerges as well? Like, yes. I didn't do this, this week.
Yes.
I'm not a good Christian. I'm boiling it down to really simple terms, but there's that kind of emerging as well.
Yeah, I think one thing that we've, like you note, is hedonism, as we've understood it as a central feature of culture, has withdrawn a little bit. I just watched the Vince McMahon series on Netflix about the former owner of the WWE. Wrestling.
Yeah.
Because everyone knew this is where we're going, wrestling.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting watching it back, because I remember, they go back to the 70s and the 80s when wrestling got big. And then they go to that sort of weird sort of late 90s, 2000s period. And wrestling goes from something for kids to really elements which are quite explicit, violent, very highly sexualized. And watching it now, it's shocking. But that was the era. So, but hear me, I'm not making an excuse for wrestling in the 90s, 2000s. No one sent that email. But they make a point that the entire culture, there was this hugely hedonistic, almost anarchic, rebellious period during that time, which was highly sexualized. And that was what was glamorized by the culture. The forefront of culture was doing that. Movies were doing that. Television were doing that. Constant pushing of boundaries. So that was almost irreligiosity at its forefront. And Tertullian, reportedly, although it's doubted whether he actually said this, said just as Jesus was on the cross, was crucified between two thieves, the gospel is forever in between irreligiosity and religiosity as two extremes. So it holds this point between those two extremes. So that period was this irreligious period. You know what I mean? Like feminism was this almost highly sexualized power thing. Like all that stuff was happening. It was just like a eat, drink and be merry, for tomorrow we may die, period. Where we are now, there's a cultural element of religiosity. There is a wanting to portray yourself as doing the right thing. You see this in the secular culture, political correctness. There is this sense of eating right in so many different fields, from wellness, eating clean, saying the right thing, being virtue signaling. We've flipped back to a sort of cultural moment. Is that everywhere? No. You can still go to lots of places where hedonism still rules absolutely supreme, but it's not at the cultural forefront and it's not pushed by elites in the same exact way. And there's almost this sort of moral revealing of, look at the P. Diddy allegations and, this revealing of almost where you've almost got this sort of, not inquisition, I don't know, it's a crazy word, but almost like all these things during that period that were happening. The Playboy Mansion was, like this almost cultural icon for a period there, but now like this is what happened actually there. So this is massive revealing and almost the sort of cultural, moral calling to account of that previous period.
Yeah.
So the cultural energy is actually around a more religious, moral form. And the danger is, Chesterton said, one of the problems with the world is when the virtues run wild, disconnected from a totality. And I think that's a great way of understanding this. And I think this is the uncomfortability that a lot of people feel, that almost these things are really helpful. I still practice practices, but there's an element that disconnected from the totality, they can run into an extreme. And one point I'm trying to say is that if the habitus has changed from a hedonistic, seductive world to one where, no, you need to be seen doing the right thing. You need to take back control in a world which is spiraling out of control. That habitus can then, inject that sense of control back into practices. It can become an practices. The primary motivation for bringing spiritual practices into your life cannot be as a corrective to the culture. So I'm really burnt out. Life's really hard these days. So if I just practice this and practice that, it's not a therapy. To the culture. The primary reason we do practices, and the church has always done them, is to form us into Christ-likeness. The minute that they become, that's a secondary. So if you do the practices, will your life potentially get better? Yes. May you have more peace? Yes. But also, it could lead you to a mission field filled with uncomfortability, chaos, and suffering. So there's just a danger, we've got to be really careful here that in almost the promise of these things, by doing these things, they're corrective to our current cultural crisis, and they're correctives to that. The practices become a medicine to the chaos of the habitus. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. So, if there are people listening who are experiencing what you're saying and asking these questions, are we over-focusing on practices? People in my congregations or friends I have are becoming over-religious about this. What's your encouragement to them?
Yes. So, I think Tertullian's, again, too, did he say it or not? Anyway, regardless, if I was him, I'd want to attribute it to me. It's a great little thing. That the gospel is always in this tension point between irreligion and religion. To those lost in irreligion, it calls us back to a formed life, formed in Christ, and calls God's order out over chaos. To those who are caught in the fleshly elemental forces of the world, to use the Paul's language in Galatians, which are that rules and rituals will actually form us, not primarily Christ and his Spirit. They bring grace. And so I think one of the key things is that, and look, I'm going to bring it back to, often people say to me that something they appreciate about rebuilders, this is me getting out and giving us feedback. So this is feedback for you guys as well. One of the things people say is, what we love is that you guys talk about these ideas, but then you're in a church, you reflect on what it's actually like in your lives. And so it's not just in an ivory tower. It's actually, here's these ideas, but then we're like, got to go from really often we go from this into meetings where what does this look like in a church setting? Yeah. Or you're hearing us, and we've all had our moments of tears and emotions on this podcast is because this is real life for us. And it's not just theory, it's also practice. So there's an element of practice is going to draw us back to the bringing of actions from theory into the milieu of everyday life. So I think one of the dangers is that practices cannot be something which is done in isolation from your church. It has to be done in a cultural context of a people coming together in the church. And because we live in a moment where, and I've just written a book on this, where platform dynamics and institutions are downplayed, platforms are held up, and a platform gives you the ability to do something which forms you disconnected from the in-person contextual reality of a community. Yes. So when I have a practice, I have to bring that into Mark Sayer's life, who lives in a particular place and has kids and has limitations and bills and weeds that grow in my garden, and is part of a church which is filled with wonderfully human people created in the image of God, but also who are fallen and unfallen. And all of that is an utter mess. So I think one of the dangers is when practices and spiritual formation become something that you do as a retreat from the chaos. And after the last couple of years of COVID and everything we've gone through, the church can feel like a chaotic place. And the church often feels like it's fallen because it's filled with fallen people. That I think one of the correctives to that question is, this is going to be messy. It's going to be messy. This is not a way in which you can retreat from the world to do this as sort of a personal project with people. Your small group may be doing it, but there's an element that it has to be done, and there's grace in ordinary life, if that makes sense.
Yes.
Yeah, I'll be fascinated your guys' reflections on that.
Well, as you're talking, I'm just reminded of the sermon series that you're delivering at the moment on Ephesians. The series is called Advance, and a concept that you've brought to us, which I think came from Darrell Johnson, is that right? The 4-dimension. Yeah, a 4-dimension view of life. And you've talked about how we can see our lives in 2D, which is the self and the environment. But then there's also, if we look at our lives as a 4-dimensional life, there is self, environment, the living God, and the heavenlies.
Yes.
And what the connection I'm kind of seeing here as you've been talking is that if we look at our lives as just myself and my environment, and I can control my environment, and I can make sure I get up at this time of the day and study and read my Bible, and do this all in isolation of our own power, we're neglecting the life-giving nature of God.
Yes.
The Holy Spirit making us alive in Christ.
Yes.
As Ephesians talks about. So I think that there's that invitation, just like that tension you talked about, Jesus between the two others on the cross, that we need the Spirit to make these things alive. Like none of these things in and of themselves are going to do anything without God's power and presence.
And I think too, like this is where it also, in a sense, practices also exposes our privilege, and privilege is an overused word, but I'm going to use it in this sense that I was speaking to someone recently whose church does lots of practices, and they did say though that what they noticed was singles, couples without kids can press into it, empty nesters, but their families are just absolutely struggling to press into this because of just the chaos of life. Or, people who work in factories or have multiple jobs or work night shift or don't have the capacity to take a day off it. That's regular shift work, all this sort of stuff. So there is an element where I think the danger is it can't just be a sort of discipleship model for people who just have the ability to be in control and have lots of time. That needs to be brought back from just, the people whose lives need ordering because they've been disordered because they've got too many options. But then there are people who literally lives are disordered because of they're living a life in a complex environment. And so I think that there's an element to that. This has to be fed through that. And I think that, I've met people who feel tremendous guilt or in situations like I just described who can't do this and perhaps in a small group with people who can. And so all of this, so what I'm saying is, yes, practices, yes, spiritual formation, yes, discipleship, but it has to be done in a way in which that is like, just as we bring our great ideas at Rebuilders to the chaos and complexity of everyday life, and sometimes realize those ideas aren't as great as we think. The same needs to be done with practices. Ralph Winter wrote a really interesting article years and years ago, and I can't remember what it's called, but it was in the Perspectives book. We'll link it in the notes. If you want to subscribe to Rebuilders, you'll get it. But effectively in there, he said the church has almost taken two forms. It's almost like two wings of a bird throughout the ages. And one he called modalities, which is like the church congregation. It's open doors. Anyone can come. The person who literally has been a reprobate and filled with sin and the night before was doing unspeakable sin can trundle into church still smelling of alcohol the next morning and hear the sermon and be accepted in grace. And it's like the inclusive element of the church outwards. That's the congregation, the modality. But then he talked about too that there were sodalities. That is, people like St. Francis, had this call to rebuild the church, and he had particular vows and practices that he asked those in a monastic order to fulfill. And, he went to the Pope, and I think the legend, I can't remember the historicity of these things, but, said he smelt or something like that. And he came back later and the Pope said, all right, he granted him the ability to create an order. So an order in the Catholic Church was where people take particular kinds of monastic vows, and it could be silence or poverty or, mobility or whatever these things. And, similar in Protestantism, this could be particular missions agency. You may have a missions agency to China to join this, you have to go through a different vetting process and you have to raise support and you go to China. Or it could be a discipleship-based sort of sodality. So two wings of the church. And he said the church at certain times gets those things messed up. And I think there's a moment where there's a danger the spiritual formation movement ends up becoming sodality. That's the order, but is trying to do that in the midst of a modality. Now, I think people like Wesley brilliantly combined the two, where they had like Sunday worship, but then there were those who wanted to go deeper. He had his societies and circles, and Moravians did very similar things, and small groups have been like that. So there is an element where I think you need the potential for people who want to go deeper. But if you don't have an understanding of those two dynamics, you'll either end up not trying to form people at all, and your church may be growing on the outside, but not much discipleship is happening, or you'll end up with something which is trying to exist inside the church or breaks away from the church and becomes like a sodality. Now, if you want to create an order, go for it, but be aware that you're creating an order. And an order is, it's worked in the Catholic Church when people have signed up for many years, or that, and there's some things like the Order of the Mustard Seed and other sort of orders which, you sign up for a year or whatever. I think that's how they do it. But people who become Jesuits or Franciscans or Carmelites or whatever, that often worked with a massive high commitment.
Yes.
But I think what people are trying to do is they want the best of the sodality, but it can't come from an individualistic dynamic. Does that make sense? Yeah. Yeah.
So this is a big challenge facing the church, but there's a number of ways that we can look at this challenge and approach it.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think, it's one thing we often believe on Rebuilders is we don't see ourselves as the fount of all answers. We're not going to now, get you to ring in and sign up to our special discipleship program, which solves all of these issues for only $233 with a set of steak knives. But, we really believe that, the Holy Spirit brings empowerment, and revelation and creativity, and that, the people of God, or you listening across the world, that by hearing it set out in this way, that together with God, that answers will be developed. So this is getting you to think well. But I just want to just outline, I think, some of the elements of the challenge, which are going to lead us to solutions. Number one is we have to develop robust discipleship systems in the mess of community and human limitations.
Yeah.
That's really key. We could sit here and Rebuilders could easily come up with the best discipleship system after an afternoon of coffee and whiteboarding. But the reality is, it's going to happen in the fog of war in trying to apply that with people who are very human like us. The second thing too is that increasingly the challenge is, Samo Boria, who I've quoted a number of times on this podcast, talked about that essential knowledge is passed down in society when there are the kinds of apprenticeship relationships that have existed since the Middle Ages and beyond, where, say, a young person wanted to learn how to be a cabinet maker and make things out of wood, and they learned from a master cabinet maker, but they sacrificed a lot of freedom. And there's a hierarchical dynamic to that. And he said part of the problem is that now our culture sees such relationships almost as a bit creepy and cult-like.
Yeah.
And really what he's saying there is that increasingly in our age of compliance, council culture, safe spaces, where we find challenge difficult, that building robust discipleship structures, Wesley had his tickets, you stopped coming to a society if you weren't seen as, there's stories of they hear of a husband who's treating his wife poorly and he's kicked out of the discipleship thing, people who basically fell and then weren't repentant, you got kicked out. Now, if you did that today, there'd be articles flying around you of, toxic culture and all of this. So how do you do this in a way today where you bring accountability and you bring the social dynamic, but you do it in such a way where there is a lack of trust? How do you have people when they have, buy-in? This is a big challenge. We're trying to work on it here, but I don't feel we're at the point where we can offer answers yet, because I think this is something we've all got to explore. And also to discover forms of spiritual formation that are not beholden to consumerism and comfort, yet also neither to a spirit of religiosity. Again, that's that sweet spot between irreligion and religion, which is found in the gospel, where we can't do it in our own strength and God can. And perhaps it's less I am in control to he is in control. And I think also to do this in a way where we create models that don't instigate a new kind of Christian retreat. In the past, there was Christian retreat from things in the culture because we felt we would be tainted by the culture's sinfulness. I don't know. When Elvis Presley, I think there's a story, it sounds ridiculous now, but Elvis Presley, when he went on, I can't remember what show it was on, he was filmed from the waist up because him swinging his hips was seen as just too beyond the moral pale. And at that time, the church could, retreat. We have a new church building that we're currently, there's people fixing up, and the church floor was slightly slanted to prevent dancing because dancing was seen as beyond the moral pale. So there was elements where the church retreated because it didn't want to get infected by sin. I think there's a danger of a moment of retreat because people don't want to be affected by chaos and complexity. Well, those people too challenging. That's overwhelming for me. I don't know how to press through when this just seems overwhelming and everything seems out of control. So there's a danger of a new kind of Christian retreat from the chaos and complexity of the world and the challenge of the world. I think that there's also needs to be at this moment, the next sort of the habitus of the moment is. And really, I think we've moved from an ascending individualism to an imploding individualism. And so we need a model of discipleship that both speaks to the community and brings people into community, but also the individual at the same time. I think that this is really going to be the challenge of most of our lives. I think we're moving into a new political, social, cultural dynamic. It's going to be different even than it was before 2020. And how do we use practices but do them in such a way where they're rooted in the creating of Christ-likeness in us in the midst of the cultural habitats or context that we find ourselves in. This is going to be one of the great challenges at the moment. And can I just say this too? I think one of the challenges may be for the contemporary church that if you really do discipleship, your church might be smaller. Yet at the same time, we want the grace that can't be that, the bloke who has just turned up to your alpha course smelling of whiskey is then comes to church, which is just beyond him at this point. There needs to be elements where there's both that sodalic and modalic functions within the church in their right places in a sort of balanced approach to spiritual formation and discipleship.
Well, thank you, Mark, for that encouragement. And we'd really value hearing from you. If you have any thoughts about how this is playing out in your context, you can contact us. We have our subscriber chats that we send out a couple of days after every episode. You can subscribe to our mailing list by heading to rebuilders.co. There are a number of resources and links and books that were mentioned during the episode that we'll list in that email, but it also gives you a chance to respond if you had. If you're exploring this kind of stuff locally where you are, we'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to sharing with you again soon.